Solveig Aas stood on a ladder made from lashed birch poles, a blackened rag mop in her hand, and painted her new log cabin the color of a crow's wing. Behind her, in the frost-stiffened grass of the Dakota prairie, half the township of Ash Hollow had gathered to watch. Nobody said much at first. Then Henrik Boe, who had helped raise her roof beams only 2 weeks before, cleared his throat. "Solveig, you're putting a shroud on your own house." She didn't stop moving the mop. The smell of hot pine pitch and lampblack hung thick in the October air, sharper than wood smoke, almost sweet underneath. "It's tar," she said. "Not a shroud. It's black," said Henrik's wife, arms crossed against the cold. "Black is for mourning. Black is for coffins and burnt barns. You'll bring bad luck on the whole hollow, building a house the color of a grave." Solveig climbed down 2 rungs, dipped the mop again, and kept working. She was 61 years old, narrow-shouldered, her hands scarred pale, from 40 years of rope burn and boat caulking irons back in Norway. Before the crossing, before the prairie, before any of them had known her as anything but the quiet widow who kept bees and grew comfrey nobody else bothered with. "My grandfather's boathouse in Olesund was black," she said. "So was every fishing shed on that coast. 200 years. Some of them. Still standing when I left." "This isn't Norway," Henrik said. "This is open prairie. First hard winter. We'll see how your black paint holds up against a Dakota blizzard." "We will," Solveig agreed, and smiled and went back to work. She had reason to hurry. The signs had been wrong all autumn, geese leaving 3 weeks early, in ragged, silent lines instead of their usual noisy V's. Muskrat lodges built twice as thick as last year, packed with mud and cattail reed. The bark on the box elders had thickened early, and old Ferdinand Kolness, who'd trapped this country for 30 years, had told anyone who'd listened that his knees hadn't ached like this since the winter of 73. The one that killed cattle standing up in the fields, frozen where they stood chewing. Nobody in Ash Hollow had built for a winter like that. Solveig intended to. By the time the sun dropped behind the tree line that first evening, one long wall of her cabin gleamed black and wet in the low light, and the whole township thought she'd lost her mind. She let them think it. There wasn't time to explain, and even if there had been, she doubted words alone would convince them. Some things a person has to see for themselves. The tar itself she'd been rendering for 2 weeks in a cast-iron kettle behind the cabin, a slow, smoking, foul-smelling business that had drawn complaints before the painting had even started. Pine knots, the resin-heavy heartwood cut from old, dead stumps, split fine and packed into a covered pit, burned slow and starved of air until the wood gave up its dark, viscous pitch instead of turning to ash. She'd learned the pit-burning method as a girl, watching her father and uncles do it every autumn on the fjord, the whole process taking a full day and night, the men taking turns feeding the fire, just enough oxygen to keep it smoldering, never enough to let it flame. Out here on the prairie there was no established pit, no generations of men who knew the trick of it. She dug her own, lined it with flat stones hauled from the creek bed, and burned through 3 failed batches before she got pitch instead of char. Her hands blistered. Her nephew Peter Aas, 16, and newly arrived from the old country to work her claim, thought she was mad too. Though he never said so outright, he just watched her with the wary patience of a boy raised to respect his elders even when he didn't understand them. "Why not just whitewash it, like everyone else?" he asked, on the 3rd night as she skimmed a black, glossy film off the top of the kettle. "Lime's cheaper, faster. Whitewash reflects the sun," Solveig said. "I want the opposite." "Why would you want that?" "Summer's over. We want to keep the sun out, not pull it in." She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she handed him the ladle. "Feel the tar. Careful, it's hot." He touched 2 fingers near, not into, the black surface, felt the heat radiating off it even a few inches away, and frowned. "It holds the sun's heat like a stove lid," he said slowly. "Now you're asking the right question," Solveig said. "Keep asking it." She wouldn't say more than that. Not yet. She had learned long ago that a lesson handed over too easily is a lesson forgotten by spring. Better that he watch it happen. Better that all of them watched it happen. The chinking came first. Before any tar touched wood, moss packed tight between the logs, sealed over with a clay and ash mortar she mixed herself, worked deep into every gap with a flat wooden spatula, until her fingers cracked from the cold. Most of her neighbors used plain mud chinking, which cracked and fell out by midwinter, letting drafts whistle through by January. Solveig's mortar had ash mixed in, fine, from the hardwood fires, not the soft ash of pine, which she'd learned resisted frost heave better, holding its shape through the freeze-thaw cycles that split ordinary clay apart. Then, and only then, did she begin coating the outer log walls with the pitch and lampblack mixture, working it in thin layers with rag mops, always with the grain, always on dry, cold days when the tar would set hard rather than run. The neighbors called it a wasted effort. Tar was dear out here. She'd had to trade 3 seasons worth of dried herbs and cough remedies to a passing trader just to get enough pine resin to supplement her own rendering, since the local timber was mostly cottonwood and bur oak, poor sources of pitch. Henrik's wife told anyone who'd listen that Solveig had traded away good medicine for a house that looked like it belonged to a dead woman. Solveig kept painting. She painted through the first hard frost, breath fogging, tar thickening in the cold, so she had to keep the kettle simmering near the wall and dip the mop often, working fast before each stroke stiffened. She painted the leeward wall first, the north face, the one that would take the worst of the winter wind, reasoning that, if her supply ran short, that was the wall that needed protection most. It very nearly did run short. 2/3 through the job, the kettle scraped empty, and she still had the roof shakes and the south wall bare. "We stop here," Peter said, relieved, expecting the strange project to end. "We don't stop," Solveig said. "We go back to Ferdinand's woodlot. There's pine stumps rotting out there nobody wants. We render again." They rendered again. It cost them 4 more days. 4 more days closer to whatever the sky was gathering. But by the time the second batch of pitch was cooling in the kettle, the wind had already begun to carry a mineral, metallic smell that Solveig recognized from 30 prairie winters. The smell of snow, still 2 or 3 days off, but coming. The first real test came before the blizzard, a hard cold snap in early November. 3 days where the mercury dropped below 0 at night and barely climbed past freezing at noon. Not dangerous, not yet, but enough to show something. Solveig noticed it first in the mornings. Frost rimed every log cabin in the hollow, furred white edges, climbing the corners, thickening along the north walls where the sun never quite reached, except hers. Her black north wall, the one she'd painted first, stayed nearly bare by comparison, just a faint gray dusting that burned off within an hour of daylight. She said nothing about it. She only watched, and made a small mark with charcoal on a scrapboard she kept nailed inside the door, a private ledger of firewood used each day, where the Bow household burned through a full cord in 3 days, keeping their soddy livable. Solveig's woodpile, split for a cabin roughly the same size, was lasting nearly half again as long. Peter noticed too. He noticed it the way a boy notices the things that matter to his own comfort, namely, that he was sleeping warmer than he had any right to, given how little wood they were burning. "The fire's low every morning," he said, "but the room's not cold." "How?" "Touch the south wall," Solveig told him, "at midday, when the sun's been on it a few hours." He did, and pulled his hand back in surprise. The log wall on the inside radiated a mild but unmistakable warmth. Not fire warmth, not stove warmth, but something slower, steadier, like a stone left too long by a hearth. "It's the black," he said. "It's pulling heat from the sun and holding it. Even after the sun's gone, the wood holds it," Solveig said. "The tar just makes sure the wood takes it in, instead of throwing the sun's light back the way pale wood does, the way whitewash does. Dark colors drink light. Light colors spit it back out. My father's people learned that from the sea, a black boat hull dries faster after rain than a pale one, warms faster in a cold morning. I only asked myself why a house shouldn't do the same. It wasn't the whole answer. She still hadn't told him about the moisture, or the ice, or what would happen to the roofs of every other cabin in Ash Hollow once the real snow came. She let him sit with the wall's warmth instead, let him work it out on his own terms, the way she always did. Not every part of the experiment went smoothly. 10 days before the blizzard, an unexpected rain moved through. A cold, driving rain that caught Solveig mid-coat on a section of the roof, shakes she'd left for last. She'd been careless, painting a patch of tar over shakes that still held a skin of morning frost, trusting the pitch to bond regardless. It didn't bond. The rain came, and where she'd painted over frost, the black coating lifted in ragged strips, peeling away like old paint off a barn door, leaving raw wood exposed to the weather again. She stood in the rain and looked at the damage and said something short and sharp in Norwegian that Peter didn't understand but recognized the tone of well enough. "We have to redo it," he said. "We have to do it right this time," she corrected. Frost is the enemy of tar as much as it's the enemy of anything else. Scrape it clean to bare wood first. Warm the wood if you can. Never coat over ice, no matter how thin. That's the lesson, and it's a lesson the hard way, which is the only way I ever seem to learn anything. They redid the patch 2 days later, on a rare dry, sunlit afternoon, scraping every shakedown to clean grain first, warming the tar kettle close by, so the pitch stayed workable in the cold, applying it thin and even, and this time it held. It was a small failure. But it mattered later, more than either of them understood yet. The blizzard came on the 16th of November, a full week earlier than the worst storms usually arrived. And it came fast, a green-gray wall of cloud sweeping down from the northwest that Ferdinand Colness spotted from his porch at 2 in the afternoon and rode from farm to farm shouting warning, his horse's breath streaming white. "Get your stock in, get your water in. This one's not stopping by tonight, battin' for 3 days. Maybe more." Solveig had already been battening for a week. She and Peter drove the last of the chickens into the coop, packed extra hay into the goat shed, filled every water barrel they owned, and carried in wood enough, by her calculation, for 5 days of careful burning, though she suspected quietly that they wouldn't need nearly that much. By nightfall, the wind had teeth. By midnight, it was a scream. Snow didn't fall so much as travel sideways, and the temperature, by Solveig's little mercury thermometer nailed outside the window, dropped to 11 below zero before the storm was even a day old, and kept falling. Inside, the cabin held. The fire burned low and steady in the stone hearth, and the black log walls, chinked tight, sealed against every draft, kept the wind's worst violence outside where it belonged. Peter slept, eventually, exhausted from the day's work. Solveig didn't. Not much. She lay awake, listening to the wind and thinking of the other cabins in the hollow, the pale, unpainted ones, and what 3 days of this might do to them. She found out on the second day, during a brief and eerie lull in the storm, an hour of stillness that old prairie hands knew better than to trust, the eye of something, not the end. Henrik Bow came stumbling through knee-deep drifts, half frozen, pounding on her door. "The barn roof's coming down," he gasped. Once she'd pulled him inside and set him by the fire. Snow's packed thick on it. Wet snow, heavy, and the whole ridge beam's groaning like it means to split. "I've got animals in there. I need hands." Solveig didn't hesitate, though every practical bone in her body told her the smart choice was to stay by her own fire. She bundled into her coldest weather layers. Sealskin mittens brought from Norway, a wool scarf wound twice around her face, and went out into the white with Peter close behind her. What she saw at the Bow farm told her everything she needed to know, though she'd already half guessed it. The Bows' cabin and barn were pale, unpainted, whitewashed years ago, and never touched since. Snow had built up on every north-facing surface in a thick, undisturbed blanket. 6 inches, 8 in places, packed and refrozen from the brief afternoon thaws and the hard overnight freezes that followed. The weight of it was bowing the barn's ridgepole visibly, straining at joints that hadn't been built to carry that kind of load. Along the eaves, ice had built into thick, glassy fangs, and where the ice met the wood, Solveig could already see the telltale dark stains of moisture working its way beneath the shakes. Water that would freeze again tonight, expand, and split the wood grain from the inside. The same slow violence that cracked stone foundations and split fence posts every hard winter on this prairie. "We need to clear it before the wind picks back up," Solveig said, already climbing toward the barn's lower eave with a long-handled rake Peter had grabbed from the tool shed. "Break the ice dams first, work the snow off before it packs any heavier. Careful, that beam won't hold much longer." They worked fast, the 3 of them, raking and shoveling snow off the barn roof by lantern light while the animals bawled below, unsettled by the cold and the commotion. It was brutal, freezing work, and they'd cleared perhaps half the roof when the wind returned. A low moan at first, rising fast, the eye of the storm closing. "Inside, now!" Solveig shouted, and they scrambled down as the second half of the blizzard slammed back over the hollow like a door. They didn't finish clearing that roof. They barely made it back to Solveig's cabin before the wind turned dangerous again, visibility dropping to nothing, the temperature plunging further still. Behind them, in the renewed darkened howl, the Bow's barn ridge beam cracked audibly, a sound like a rifle shot swallowed almost instantly by the wind. They spent the remaining day and night of the storm packed into Solveig's cabin. Herself, Peter, Henrik, and by morning, Henrik's wife and 2 children as well, who'd abandoned their own increasingly frigid, ice-rimed soddy for the warmth of Solveig's black-walled house. It was crowded. It was, by any measure, uncomfortable. Too many bodies in too small a space. Blankets stretched over every surface, the goats bleating from the lean-to shed attached to the cabin's south wall. But it was warm, genuinely, steadily warm, in a way that struck all of them as strange, given how little wood Solveig fed the fire. "How is it warmer in here than it was in my own house with the stove roaring?" Henrik's wife asked on the second night, hands wrapped around a tin cup of chicory coffee, color returning slowly to her cheeks. Solveig didn't answer with a lecture. She simply walked to the south wall, the one that had, hours earlier during another brief clearing in the storm, caught 2 hours of thin, pale winter sun, and pressed her bare palm flat against the log. "Feel this," she said. Henrik's wife did, and her eyebrows rose. The log was warm, not hot, but noticeably, unmistakably warm, radiating heat back into the room hours after the sun that had struck it was gone, buried again behind storm cloud. "That's not the fire," she said. "The fire's on the other side of the room." "No," Solveig agreed. "That's the wall. It drank the sun while it could, and it's giving it back now. Every dark surface does it. A black kettle heats faster on a stove than a bright one. A dark stone in a field is warm long after sunset, while a white one's already cold. I only did to my house what the sun already knows how to do to everything else. The tar makes the wood dark enough and tight enough to actually hold what it takes in." "And the snow?" Peter asked, from where he sat mending a harness strap by lantern light. "Why doesn't it build up on our roof the way it has on the Boses?" Solveig thought about that one a moment before answering, choosing her words with the particular care of someone who has watched a fact prove itself and doesn't need to embellish it. "Same reason," she said. "Any sun at all that gets through this storm, even weak, even through thin cloud, warms the black shakes just enough to loosen the snow's grip. It slides before it can pack. Pale roofs like the Bose throw that same sun straight back. They never warm enough to shed anything. The snow just sits and packs and freezes and sits some more until the weight's more than the beams were built to carry." Henrik, silent through most of this, finally spoke from his corner by the fire, his voice rough with something between embarrassment and awe. "I called it a shroud," he said. 2 weeks ago, I stood in your yard and called it a shroud." "You did," Solveig said without malice. "My barn's ridge beam is cracked in half because of a superstition about the color black," he said. That's a hard thing to sit with." "It's an easier thing to sit with than losing your animals," Solveig said. "Which you didn't. That's what matters tonight." The blizzard broke on the morning of the 19th, 3 full days after it began, leaving behind a hard, brilliant, blinding blue sky and a prairie buried in drifts taller than a man in places. The cold didn't break with it. If anything, the clear night that followed the storm's exit brought the coldest temperature of the whole event. Deep enough to crack green wood and freeze the water bucket solid, despite sitting 6 feet from the hearth. But Solveig's cabin held through that, too. The black walls doing their slow, patient work through every hour of pale winter sun that touched them, however brief. When the township finally dug itself out and began taking stock of the damage, the pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 barns had lost roofs entirely to the accumulated snow load. Ridge beams snapped clean through. A dozen cabins had split logs along their north-facing walls. The wood cracked from moisture that had worked in under failing chinking and then frozen, expanded, and torn the grain apart from the inside. The same slow violence Solveig had seen building on the Bose eaves before the second half of the storm hit. 2 families had lost livestock to cold that found its way in through walls that simply couldn't hold heat the way they needed to. Solveig's cabin stood exactly as it had before the storm, if a little scorched smelling from 3 days of close cooking fires and crowded bodies. Her firewood supply, by her charcoal ledger, had lasted the entire event with a full day's reserve left over. While households half again, her size had burned through everything they owned and started breaking up fence rails for fuel by the second night. Word travels fast in a small hollow, faster still after a storm like that one. By the time the roads were passable again, half the township had come, one way or another, to stand in Solveig's yard and look at her black walls with an expression considerably different from the one they'd worn 3 weeks earlier. "Teach us," Henrik said simply, standing amid the wreckage of his own barn, hat in hand. "Whatever it is you know. Teach us before next winter." Solveig looked at her cabin, black-walled, black-roofed, standing solid and warm against a sky so cold and clear, it looked as though it might shatter, and thought of her father's boathouse on the Aulakan coast, 200 years old, painted the same color, holding through storms that had swallowed lesser buildings whole. "It isn't magic," she said. "It's only tar and lampblack, and knowing that the sun, even in the dead of winter, is still worth something if you know how to ask for it. My people learned it from the sea a long time before I was born. I only carried it here because I couldn't think of a reason it wouldn't work just as well on land as it did on water." "Then teach us," Henrik said again. "I will," Solveig said. "Come spring, when the pine's running sap again, and we can render pitch properly. It's slow work. It's dirty work. It cost me most of a season's medicine trade just to get enough of it done." "It's cheaper than a new barn," Henrik said, and for the first time since she'd known him, He almost smiled. By the following autumn, 6 cabins in Ash Hollow wore black walls facing the winter sun, tarred and sealed the way Solveig had taught them. Chink first, scrape frost before coating, thin layers with the grain, always on dry days, patience over haste. None of them called it a shroud anymore. Some of the children took to calling it Solveig's coat, as though the whole Hollow's houses had been dressed for the cold, the way a person might bundle into a good wool coat before stepping outside. Solveig never claimed to have invented anything. She only remembered something the rest of them had forgotten, or never known at all, that in a country where winter was the only enemy that mattered, the color of a wall could be the difference between a house that fought the cold all season and one that simply quietly let the sun do the fighting for it. And on the coldest, clearest days of the years that followed, when the low winter sun climbed just high enough to touch the black log walls of Ash Hollow, anyone who cared to press a bare hand against that dark wood in the afternoon would feel it. Faint, patient, unmistakable, giving back, hour after hour, everything the sky had lent it.